The year is 1928, and New York City is a symphony of ambition and excess. Its glittering crescendo played out in the grand townhouses of Park Avenue. Inside one such residence, the air is thick with the scent of roasted duck, exotic spices, and expensive French perfume. Laughter and the syncopated rhythms of a live jazz band spill from the grand ballroom, where the city's most powerful figures, bankers, politicians, and socialites, gather to pay homage to their host. They raise their crystal glasses to Chef Julian Blackwood, a man hailed not merely as a cook, but as a culinary messiah. His creations, laid out on silver platters like jewels, are the talk of the metropolis. Each dish is a masterpiece of flavor and presentation, a testament to a genius who has seemingly perfected the art of earthly delight. Tonight, as with every night he hosts, his guests believe they are tasting perfection itself. At the center of this opulent whirlwind stands Julian Blackwood, accepting the adulation with a practiced, serene smile. He is the image of sophistication, impeccably dressed, articulate, and possessing a charisma that draws people into his orbit effortlessly. He speaks of his philosophy, of transforming simple ingredients into transcendent experiences, of capturing the very essence of the city on a plate. But as the camera of history draws closer, it captures a chilling detail that the fawning crowds miss entirely. His smile, so warm and engaging, never quite reaches his eyes. They are windows to a profound emptiness, a cold and calculating void that observes the room not with the warmth of a host, but with the detached appraisal of a predator studying its well-fed flock. In the heart of the city's splendor, a shadow resides within its most celebrated artist. Tonight's main course is his signature dish, a terrine of unparalleled richness, served with a glistening dark cherry reduction. Blackwood describes it to his captivated audience as a mosaic of flavors, a complex and daring creation that requires the most delicate and meticulously sourced cuts of meat. The texture is sublime, melting on the tongue with a tenderness that defies explanation. The aroma is intoxicating, a unique blend of cloves, star anise, and a secret spice he claims to import from a remote corner of the world. It is this scent, so celebrated and sought after, that defines his genius. It fills the room, clings to the velvet curtains, and imprints itself upon the memory of every guest. They devour his art, oblivious to the fact that the dish's secret ingredient is not a rare spice, but a profound and primal taboo, a truth hidden in plain sight. Nearly a century later, the Park Avenue townhouse stands as a skeletal ruin, a hollowed-out carcass picked clean by time and neglect. The windows are dark, vacant eyes staring out onto a city that has tried to forget the building's history. The once manicured gardens are a tangle of weeds, and the grand entrance is boarded up, a crude seal on a tomb of opulence. This is no longer a place of celebration. It is a scar on the city's landscape, a structure feared by locals and spoken of only in hushed, cautionary whispers. The laughter and jazz music have long since been replaced by an oppressive, heavy silence, broken only by the wind whistling through its decaying frame. The temple of gastronomy has become a monument to an unspeakable evil, a place whose very foundations are soaked in a legacy of horror. The legends that cling to the Blackwood property are as persistent as the ivy strangling its walls. It is said that on damp autumn nights, a faint, sweetish metallic odor still seeps from the cellar grates, the ghost of an aroma that once signified culinary artistry, but now serves as a nauseating reminder of its true source. Neighborhood residents speak of strange echoes emanating from the abandoned kitchen in the dead of night. Not the sound of ghosts, but something more methodical, more chilling. They describe the rhythmic, percussive sound of a heavy cleaver striking a thick wooden block, a lonely, industrial cadence that continues for hours before fading with the dawn. It is the sound of a meticulous, unholy work that, according to local lore, was never truly finished. How did a man so adored by the highest echelons of society become the architect of such a nefarious enterprise? How did the most exclusive banquets in New York City history conceal a secret so monstrous that its discovery would send a shockwave of revulsion through the nation? The answer lies buried in the stark contrasts of the Roaring Twenties, a time when immense wealth and abject poverty coexisted on the same island. For while the elite dined on his exquisite creations, Julian Blackwood was sourcing his ingredients from the city's forgotten corners, from the tenements of the Lower East Side. He was a predator who hunted the invisible, the people whose disappearances would go unnoticed, transforming the city's most vulnerable souls into his dark-born culinary art. The question was not if he would be discovered, but how many would vanish before the truth was unearthed. This legend is an echo that has endured for a century, a chilling reminder that the greatest monsters often wear the most respectable masks. And since these dark histories travel through time and across borders, we invite you to mark your place in this investigation. Tell us in the comments from which city you are joining us tonight, and the exact time on your clock. With your presence now recorded in our archive, let us return to the glittering veneer of 1928, to the very moment the first almost imperceptible crack began to appear in Julian Blackwood's flawless facade. It began not with a scream, but with the quiet tears of a mother and the curiosity of a young journalist. The assignment to profile Julian Blackwood was the kind of opportunity that could define a young journalist's career in 1928 New York. For Leo Vance, a recent transplant to the city with more ambition than bylines, it was a golden ticket. He arrived at the Park Avenue townhouse clutching his notepad, his mind racing with questions for the man the New York Chronicle had dubbed the alchemist of appetite. The heavy oak door opened into a world of polished marble and hushed reverence, an environment that felt more like a museum than a home. Leo, accustomed to the city's relentless clamor, was immediately struck by the profound, almost sterile silence of the residents, a quietude that seemed to absorb sound. He was being led not into a home, but into a carefully curated sanctuary, the domain of a man who controlled every element within his world, and Leo was now one of them. The interview was a masterclass in controlled charisma. Julian Blackwood spoke not of recipes, but of philosophy. He described his culinary art as a form of urban alchemy, a process of distilling the city's very essence onto a plate. He was articulate, his voice a smooth, calming baritone that could make the most mundane subject sound like a profound revelation. Leo found himself utterly captivated, scribbling notes furiously as Blackwood explained how a perfect dish could capture a fleeting moment in time, a feeling, a memory. Yet, as the chef gestured elegantly with his long, slender fingers, Leo couldn't shake a sense of practiced performance. Blackwood's words were passionate, but his eyes remained detached, observing Leo not as a conversational partner, but as an audience member whose reaction was being carefully measured and assessed for its sincerity. To add depth to his profile, Leo decided to trace the celebrated chef's footsteps back to their source. He ventured from the rarefied air of Park Avenue into the dense, chaotic tapestry of the Lower East Side, where Blackwood purportedly sourced some of his humble ingredients. The contrast was a physical shock. Here, the air was thick with the smells of fish, unwashed bodies, and coal smoke, a world away from the delicate perfumes of Blackwood's kitchen. The streets teemed with a raw, desperate humanity that the city's elite preferred to ignore. It was in this vibrant, struggling world that Leo hoped to find the authentic roots of Blackwood's genius, to understand how he transformed the city's grit into gastronomic gold. He believed the soul of the story was here, amidst the pushcarts and tenement buildings, not in the polished facade uptown. It was near the Fulton Fish Market, amidst the cacophony of shouting vendors and rattling carts, that a sound of pure, unadulterated grief cut through the noise. He saw a woman, her face etched with sorrow, weeping into a worn shawl. Her name was Maria Rossi, and her story was one of countless quiet tragedies swallowed by the city's indifference. Her 16-year-old son, Marco, had vanished 3 weeks prior. He was a beggar, one of the city's many invisible children who survived on scraps and the occasional coin. Maria spoke of him with a heartbreaking mix of love and despair, describing a boy who, despite his circumstances, noticed everything. He had often spoken to her about the strange, fancy chef who would visit the market, a man who always seemed to be studying the crowds with an unnerving intensity, his gaze lingering on the lost and the lonely. A professional chill, cold and sharp, ran down Leo's spine. He asked Maria for the exact date her son had disappeared. As she tearfully recounted the day, Leo flipped through his notepad, his heart beginning to pound a slow, heavy rhythm against his ribs. The date she gave, October 12, 1928, was a date he knew well. It was emblazoned on the invitations and press clippings he had collected for his research. It was the night of Julian Blackwood's widely acclaimed Autumn Equinox Banquet, an event lauded in the society pages for its daring and unforgettable main course. The connection was tenuous, a whisper of a coincidence, yet it felt like a discordant note in the flawless symphony of Blackwood's public life, a detail too chilling to be mere chance. The city suddenly felt much darker, its shadows deeper and more menacing. Leo arranged a second meeting, under the pretense of observing the artist in his element. This time, he entered the townhouse not with awe, but with a gnawing suspicion. Blackwood's kitchen was a marvel of modern efficiency, a gleaming expanse of stainless steel and copper. What struck Leo most profoundly was the almost surgical sterility of the space. Every surface was polished to a mirror shine, every tool hung in its precise place. He watched Blackwood work, his movements economical and precise. The chef's obsession with cleanliness was absolute. After handling even the most pristine vegetables, he would wash his hands and wipe down his German-made cleavers with a ritualistic fervor. It was a level of meticulousness that bordered on the pathological, as if he were constantly trying to scrub away some unseen, indelible stain that only he could perceive. Seeking to probe the chef's peculiar nature, Leo steered the conversation toward his culinary preferences, asking a seemingly innocuous question about the meats he chose to work with. Blackwood's face lit up as he described the delicate flesh of a quail, the robust flavor of venison, the marbled perfection of a rib roast. He spoke like a poet, transforming butchery into an act of reverence. Leo then casually asked why pork, a meat so fundamental to both rustic and refined cuisine, never appeared on his menus. The shift in Blackwood's demeanor was instantaneous and startling. The warm, engaging artist vanished, replaced by a man whose eyes flashed with a cold, undisguised contempt. The mask had not just slipped, it had been momentarily ripped away, revealing something unsettling beneath. "Pork," Blackwood scoffed, the word dripping with disdain, "is a profoundly vulgar meat." He paused, carefully choosing his words as if delivering a final, unassailable judgment. Its flavor profile is pedestrian, an unsubtle canvas for a true artist. But more than that, he continued, leaning in slightly, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. Its texture is disappointingly familiar. It is far too similar to other, less desirable meats. It lacks the necessary distinction to be elevated. The explanation was so bizarre, so specific in its strange logic, that it left Leo speechless. The phrase, "less desirable meats," echoed in the sterile kitchen, a cryptic and deeply disturbing pronouncement that seemed to hint at a gruesome, unspoken comparison, known only to the chef himself. Leaving the opulent residence for the second time, Leo Vance felt a profound sense of dread solidifying in his gut. The glittering world of Julian Blackwood now seemed like a meticulously constructed illusion. The charming anecdotes, the philosophical musings on food, the sterile perfection of his kitchen, it all felt like an elaborate stage set designed to hide a terrible truth. The weeping mother in the market, the date of her son's disappearance, the chef's obsessive cleanliness, and his bizarre, venomous dismissal of a common foodstuff, these were no longer isolated details. They were beginning to connect, forming the faint outline of a monstrous reality that lurked just beneath the city's glamorous surface. The story he had been assigned was not about a chef. It was about a predator hiding in plain sight. Back in the cramped confines of his apartment, surrounded by the glow of the city that never slept, Leo spread his notes across his small wooden desk. On one side were the glowing press reviews, the descriptions of decadent feasts, and the image of a smiling, celebrated genius. On the other was the tear-streaked face of Maria Rossi and a single, haunting date. The chasm between these two worlds was vast, yet he was now certain a bridge existed, built by Julian Blackwood in the dead of night. The initial flicker of suspicion had ignited into a consuming fire. His flattering profile piece was dead, and in its place was a terrifying investigation. He was no longer just a journalist. He was the sole witness to the first cracks appearing in the facade of a monster. November 1928 arrived, draping New York City in a festive and deceptive veil of civic pride for the annual Gotham Harvest Festival. The streets throbbed with a vibrant energy, a cacophony of vendors hawking roasted chestnuts, the blare of brass bands, and the collective laughter of a metropolis determined to celebrate its own prosperity. Banners and lights adorned the avenues, transforming the city into a grand stage for public joy. At the heart of this celebration was the mayor's gala, the festival's most exclusive event, for which Julian Blackwood had been commissioned to create the centerpiece banquet. While the city reveled in the crisp autumn air, its most celebrated chef was preparing for a harvest of his own, moving through the celebrating crowds with an entirely different kind of appetite, his predatory gaze scanning the ephemeral sea of faces for one that would not be missed, a perfect ingredient for his masterpiece. Among the millions toiling in the city's shadows was Eleanor Finch, a 19-year-old seamstress whose existence was a quiet testament to resilience. She spent 12 hours a day hunched over a sewing machine in a cramped tenement sweatshop, her world defined by the drone of machinery and the ever-present smell of dyed fabric. Her dreams, however, were as delicate and intricate as the embroidery she stitched. Her only connection to a life beyond the squalor was a small, silver locket that hung around her neck, a cherished heirloom from her late mother. It was a simple, heart-shaped piece, bearing the faint engraving of a sparrow on its surface. This object was more than mere metal. It was the repository of her history, and the symbol of a future she desperately hoped to find somewhere beyond the grimy windows of her workshop, a small piece of beauty in a life of relentless hardship. On the second evening of the festival, the distant sounds of celebration were a siren's call Eleanor could no longer ignore. Leaving the suffocating confines of the sweatshop, she was drawn toward the brilliant glow of the uptown districts, a world she had only ever glimpsed from afar. She walked north, her worn shoes carrying her across the invisible line that separated poverty from opulence. Eyewitnesses, later questioned by a desperate Leo Vance, would provide fragmented recollections of a slight, dark-haired girl with wide, hopeful eyes, mesmerized by the dazzling shop windows and the elegant couples strolling along Park Avenue. She was a ghost, drifting through a banquet to which she was not invited, completely unaware that her journey from the periphery to the center of the city's splendor had made her tragically, fatally visible to a host who was always watching for new guests to arrive at his private table. The following morning, the sun rose over a city still shaking off the remnants of its festivities, but for Eleanor Finch, it did not rise at all. Her small, rented room in the tenement building was found undisturbed, the bed neatly made, her few possessions exactly where she had left them. She had simply vanished, erased from the city's ledger as cleanly as a chalk mark wiped from a slate. At the local precinct, her disappearance was recorded with bureaucratic indifference, filed away as just another case of a young woman from the slums likely running off for a better life or a worse fate. It was a common, unremarkable tragedy in a city that produced them by the thousands. For the machinery of New York, Eleanor Finch had ceased to exist. Her absence was a silent void, a story with no final chapter, destined to be forgotten by everyone except those who knew the quiet strength of her spirit. In the pre-dawn hours, while the city still slept, an old street sweeper named Cormac Abernathy began his solitary ritual. He was one of New York's phantoms, a man whose labor was essential, yet whose presence was entirely overlooked. His daily route was a map of the city's excesses and secrets, taking him through the service alleys behind the grand townhouses of Park Avenue. He knew the routines of these wealthy households by the nature of their refuse: the empty champagne bottles, the discarded invitations, the wilted imported flowers. He worked methodically, his broom whispering across the cobblestones, a lonely sound in the deep silence of the morning. The alley behind Julian Blackwood's residence was always the last and most peculiar stop on his route, a place where the garbage was meticulously bagged but from which a faint, sweetish odor always seemed to emanate, a smell that clung to the damp air like a sickness. On the morning of November 16th, as Cormac emptied a heavy metal trash can behind Blackwood's kitchen, a glint of silver caught the dim light of his lantern. It was nestled amongst potato peels, blood-stained butcher's paper, and discarded vegetable tops. His gloved fingers, calloused from years of work, carefully retrieved the object. It was a woman's locket, heart-shaped and tarnished with grime, the delicate chain broken. He wiped it clean on his sleeve, revealing the faint, intricate engraving of a small bird. A cold, heavy feeling settled in his stomach, a dread that had nothing to do with the morning chill. He had seen this exact locket before, many times, gracing the neck of a young seamstress, who would sometimes offer him a shy smile on his route. It was Eleanor Finch's locket, and it was lying amongst the chef's garbage like a discarded bone. A primal fear, cold and sharp, seized Cormac Abernathy. He was a simple man who understood the city's brutal calculus. The lives of people like him, and people like Eleanor, were worth nothing to the powerful men who lived in these houses. Going to the police was not an option. They would laugh him out of the station, an old sweeper with a wild story about a piece of trash. Yet the locket felt like a hot coal in his hand, a terrible secret he could not simply throw back. He knew, with an instinct born of a lifetime of observing the city from its gutters, that this was no accident. The object's presence in that specific trash can was a death sentence, a final, damning piece of evidence. He thought of the journalist, the young man who had been asking questions in the neighborhood, the one who seemed to care about the faces nobody else saw. He found Leo Vance in a small, all-night diner, hunched over a cup of coffee, his face illuminated by the glow of the streetlights outside. The journalist's table was a mess of notes, clippings, and city maps. Cormac approached cautiously, his heart pounding against his ribs. He sat down without a word and, with a trembling hand, slid the silver locket across the worn linoleum tabletop. "I found this," he whispered, his voice hoarse with fear. In the alley, behind his kitchen, Leo looked from the old man's terrified face to the object resting before him. The locket seemed to absorb the diner's dim light, its small form radiating a profound and chilling significance. It was the first solid thing to emerge from the morass of rumor and suspicion, a tangible link from the world of the lost to the doorstep of the celebrated. Leo picked up the locket, its metallic coolness a stark contrast to the warm ceramic of his coffee cup. He recognized the design from the descriptions he had gathered of the missing seamstress. He carefully pried open the delicate clasp. Inside, just as the girl's friends had described, was a tiny, faded photograph of an older woman on one side. On the other, so small he had to squint to see it, was an engraved promise, "My little sparrow, always fly home." The personal, intimate nature of the object sent a shockwave through him. This was not just a clue. It was the entire story of a life, a love, a hope, all of it now reduced to a discarded trinket found in a garbage can. The abstract horror he had been chasing had suddenly taken on a name, a face, and a heartbreaking final message. Julian Blackwood was no longer just a subject of suspicion. He was a monster. Staring at the locket in his palm, Leo felt the weight of his new reality settle upon him. His initial investigation, born of journalistic curiosity, had now become a moral imperative. He was holding the last remnant of Eleanor Finch's life, and he was perhaps the only person in the entire city who understood its true, horrifying meaning. Taking this single piece of evidence to the authorities would be professional suicide. Blackwood's connections and reputation would crush the accusation, and the locket would simply disappear into an evidence locker, forgotten forever. The rules of the game had changed. He could no longer be a reporter observing from the outside. If he wanted to unearth the truth buried in Blackwood's cellar, he would have to get inside himself. The time for questions was over. It was now time to find a way into the monster's lair. The plan required a subtlety that bordered on theatrical performance. Leo Vance, armed with a fabricated identity as an architectural historian researching Gilded Age interiors, secured a formal appointment to study the Blackwood townhouse. He presented credentials forged by a contact in the press room, a man who owed him a significant favor. Walking through the grand foyer for the third time, Leo felt the familiar, oppressive silence of the house wrap around him like a shroud. Julian Blackwood granted him access with an air of amused condescension, assigning a silent, watchful butler to chaperone the young academic. Leo's true objective lay beyond the public rooms of polished mahogany and silk wallpaper. He needed to find the chef's private study, the administrative heart of his macabre enterprise, where the numbers behind the horror were surely kept. He knew he would have only a few minutes, a brief window of opportunity that would either expose a monster or cost him his life. His chance came when the butler was momentarily called away to answer the newly installed telephone, a rare and lengthy interruption in the household's rigid routine. Feigning a deep fascination with the intricate woodwork in the main hallway, Leo slipped away, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs. He moved with a silent urgency, his memory of the house's layout guiding him toward a small, unassuming door tucked away behind a large Flemish tapestry. He had noted it on his previous visit, the only room Blackwood had not personally shown him. The door was unlocked. Inside, the room was a stark contrast to the rest of the home. Spartan, functional, and intensely private. A large oak desk dominated the space, its surface clear save for a single leather-bound volume. It was the chef's ledger, the very document he had gambled everything to find. The book felt unnervingly heavy in his hands, its dark leather cover worn smooth from frequent use. Opening it, Leo was met not with recipes, but with page after page of meticulous, almost pathologically neat columns of script. The handwriting was a precise, elegant cursive, a stark contradiction to the grotesque nature of the information it recorded. One side of each page listed legitimate expenditures: 20 saelbas, French truffles, case of Chateau Margaux, 1905, saffron, Spanish. But it was the adjacent column, under the deceptively simple heading, Provisions, that made the blood drain from his face. The entries were cryptic, coded, yet their meaning was terrifyingly clear. They were not items. They were people, reduced to a transaction. The neat script was the bookkeeping of a demon, chronicling a harvest of human souls from the city's forgotten corners. He frantically scanned the pages, his eyes darting from dates to descriptions, the pieces of the puzzle locking into place with sickening finality. An entry from October 12th read, Fulton Market, Prime Cut, 145 lbs. This was the date Marco Rossi, the beggar boy, had vanished. Another entry, dated November 15th, the night the seamstress disappeared, was even more chillingly specific. Garment District, Small Sparrow, 95 libs. The reference to her locket was unmistakable, a cruel private joke from a predator celebrating his catch. The ledger was a map of Blackwood's atrocities, a shadow geography of New York where locations like the Bowery, the docks of Hell's Kitchen, and the immigrant tenements were not neighborhoods, but hunting grounds. Each entry, with its cold notation of weight and origin, was a gravestone for a victim the city had never bothered to mourn. The genius of Blackwood's evil, Leo realized, was its integration into the mundane logic of commerce. He was treating human beings as livestock, applying the principles of a master provisioner to his unspeakable practice. The ledger detailed expenses for specialized tools, listed alongside purchases of salt and spices, and payments to a disposal service for unusable scraps. The document transformed the abstract horror into a functioning, organized business model. The celebrated artist was, at his core, a ruthlessly efficient butcher, and this book was the unabridged, unflinching record of his work. It was proof, irrefutable and absolute. Leo knew he had to get this ledger out of the house, but the sound of footsteps returning to the hallway sent a jolt of pure adrenaline through his veins. He had no time. Working with trembling fingers, he pulled out a small camera, a new portable device he had borrowed, and began to photograph the most damning pages. Each click of the shutter sounded like a gunshot in the silent room. He captured the entries for Marco Rossi and Eleanor Finch, the lists of tools, and the payments to the mysterious disposal service. Just as he finished the last shot, the doorknob began to turn. Leo shoved the ledger back onto the desk, slid the camera into his coat pocket, and spun around, pretending to be examining a bookshelf as the butler entered. The man's eyes narrowed with suspicion, a silent accusation passing between them. Leo managed a weak smile, commenting on the impressive collection of first editions before making his excuses to leave. He walked out of the townhouse and back into the New York daylight, feeling not victorious, but as if he had just escaped a tomb. The following days were a descent into a new kind of fear. Julian Blackwood was not a man who would leave such a transgression unanswered. The first sign of his displeasure arrived not as a physical threat, but as a professional one. Leo's editor, a man who had previously championed his ambition, called him into his office. His face was pale, his demeanor cold. He informed Leo that the Julian Blackwood profile was being killed. Furthermore, he had received a call from a very powerful city councilman, a close friend of Blackwood's, suggesting that Leo Vance's journalistic credentials were under review due to unethical and invasive reporting tactics. The message was clear. Blackwood was untouchable. his influence woven into the very fabric of the city's power structure. The walls were beginning to close in. The threat soon became more personal, more direct. One evening, as Leo returned to his small apartment, he found the door unlocked, the lock expertly picked. Inside, his world had been turned upside down. His notes were gone, his research materials scattered, and the film from his camera had been ripped from its casing and exposed to the light, destroying the photographic evidence he had risked everything to obtain. Nothing of value was stolen. This was not a robbery. It was an interrogation, a violation designed to terrorize him. On his desk, where his notes on Blackwood had once been, lay a single, gleaming, and professionally sharpened butcher's knife. It was a message of chilling intimacy, a promise of what was to come if he did not cease his investigation immediately. Blackwood was now actively erasing his tracks, a predator cleaning its den. Cormac Abernathy, the old street sweeper, reported that the trash behind the townhouse had changed. It was no longer filled with the usual kitchen refuse. Instead, for several nights in a row, the cans were heavy with ash and charred fragments of paper, the air thick with the smell of a large fire. Blackwood was systematically destroying his records, burning the ledger and any other incriminating documents page by page. Leo realized with a sinking heart that the monster knew he had been exposed and was now accelerating his timeline. The window to act was closing, and the evidence was turning to smoke and ash before he could present it to anyone who would listen. The city's corruption and Blackwood's power had formed an impenetrable shield. Desperate, Leo made a clandestine visit to the 17th precinct, presenting his story to a desk sergeant who regarded him with a mixture of pity and contempt. He spoke of the disappearances, the locket, and the contents of the ledger, but without the physical proof. His words were just the frantic, unsubstantiated accusations of a young reporter chasing a sensationalist fantasy. The sergeant listened, made a few perfunctory notes, and promised to look into it, a bureaucratic dismissal that both of them knew meant nothing. The police were a part of the same corrupt machine that protected men like Blackwood. As Leo left the station, he saw a familiar, elegantly dressed figure speaking with the precinct captain in his office, sharing a laugh. It was Julian Blackwood himself, paying a social call, reinforcing his connections, ensuring his immunity. The journalist was now completely isolated, a pariah in his own profession and a target for a man who operated above the law. His friends distanced themselves, fearful of the powerful forces he had provoked. He began to see shadows in every doorway, to feel the weight of unseen eyes following him as he walked the city streets. The paranoia was a constant, suffocating companion. He was no longer the hunter. He was the hunted. Blackwood had masterfully turned the tables, using his social and political capital to discredit and intimidate his accuser into silence. Leo's investigation had hit a wall of power and influence he could not hope to breach alone. His credibility was destroyed, his evidence gone, and his life was in imminent danger. He had failed. This realization brought with it not defeat, but a cold, hard clarity. If the system was designed to protect the monster, he would have to operate outside of it. If documented evidence could be burned and official channels closed, he would need to find proof that was physical, undeniable, and impossible to destroy. He needed to get inside the one place that held the final, gruesome truth, the source of the faint, sweetish odor that haunted the alley behind the townhouse. His mind turned to the stories he had heard while researching Blackwood, whispers of a high staff turnover, of kitchen hands who left abruptly, their faces pale with an unspoken terror. One name, in particular, stood out, a young man named Thomas, a dishwasher who had been fired just a month prior for insubordination. Finding Thomas was a journey into the city's underbelly, a search through flophouses and soup kitchens. He finally located him in a dimly lit Bowery tavern, a man haunted by what he had seen. At first, Thomas refused to speak, his eyes wide with a fear that went beyond losing a simple job. But as Leo shared his own story, laying out the pieces of the horrific puzzle, he saw a flicker of resolve in the young man's eyes. Thomas spoke in a hushed, trembling voice, confirming Leo's darkest suspicions. He spoke of the cellar, a place that was always kept locked, from which strange noises emanated late at night. He described Blackwood's solitary, hours-long butchering sessions and the heavy, ironclad door that no one was ever allowed to approach. The chef, he whispered, was not just a cook. He was a gatekeeper to a place of profound evil. Leo now had a potential key, a disgruntled witness who knew the inner workings of the house and its staff routines. The journalist explained his desperate plan. They needed to get inside the cellar. Thomas, emboldened by Leo's conviction and driven by his own conscience, finally agreed to help. He knew the layout of the service areas, the schedules of the skeleton staff who worked during Blackwood's grand events, and, most importantly, he knew of a weak point, a reinforced coal chute that led directly into the cellar, long since sealed but perhaps not impregnable. It was a plan born of utter desperation, a final, reckless gamble. They would have to break in during Blackwood's most ambitious event of the year, the upcoming Mayor's Gala, a night when the house would be full and its master completely absorbed in his performance. The stage was set for a final confrontation. The Mayor's Gala would be a night of ultimate juxtaposition. Upstairs, the city's elite would gather to feast on Blackwood's culinary masterpieces, celebrating the pinnacle of civilization and culture. Downstairs, in the darkness of the cellar, Leo Vance would be searching for the barbaric truth of its ingredients. He had informed his editor of his plan, a last-ditch effort to force the newspaper's hand. If he could provide proof from within the house, the Chronicle would have no choice but to publish, and the police would be forced to act by the sheer weight of public outrage. It was a slim hope, a fragile thread in a web of darkness, but it was the only one he had left. The hunter was preparing to walk directly into the predator's lair. As preparations for the gala began across the city, an almost festive atmosphere took hold. Invitations were polished, gowns were selected, and the newspapers buzzed with anticipation for the social event of the season. Julian Blackwood was at the center of it all, a celebrated genius putting the final touches on what was to be his greatest triumph. He moved through the city with an unassailable confidence, the very picture of success and refinement. He was completely unaware that the obscure young journalist he had dismissed as a minor nuisance was now poised to rip away his mask of civility and expose the abject horror that lurked beneath. The city was preparing for a feast, oblivious to the fact that it was about to become the audience for the revelation of an unprecedented evil. Leo Vance, in contrast, spent these final hours in the shadows, coordinating with Thomas and preparing for their infiltration. He felt a strange sense of calm descend upon him, the quiet focus that comes when all other options have been exhausted. The fear was still there, a cold knot in his stomach, but it was now overshadowed by a grim and unyielding resolve. He was no longer just a journalist chasing a story. He was an instrument of vengeance for the forgotten, for Marco, for Eleanor, and for the countless other nameless victims whose lives had been consumed by Blackwood's monstrous art. The coming night would not be a gala. It would be an excavation, a descent into the heart of a man-made hell to unearth the bones of the innocent. The investigation had reached its terminal point. The paper trail had gone cold, the witnesses were silenced, and the corridors of power were firmly locked. All that remained was the physical space of the crime itself, the locked cellar. Every clue, every disappearance, and every whispered fear had led to this single, ironclad door. The truth of Julian Blackwood's art was not written in his ledger, but carved into whatever was hidden behind that door. Leo Vance was about to cross the final threshold, leaving the world of suspicion and entering the realm of absolute, undeniable horror. The city was about to learn the true price of a seat at the most exclusive table in New York. The night of the Mayor's Gala, December 5th, 1928, was the zenith of Julian Blackwood's reign. Upstairs, in the grand ballroom, the air was a shimmering tapestry of perfume, champagne, and the warm, intoxicating aroma of Blackwood's latest creation. The mayor himself was delivering a toast, praising the chef as a civic treasure, a man who had captured the very soul of New York on a plate. But beneath the polished floors, in the cold, damp alleyway, a different kind of ceremony was underway. Leo Vance and the former dishwasher, Thomas, worked in frantic silence, their breath pluming in the winter air. They pried at the rusted hinges of the old coal chute, the screech of metal a terrifying counterpoint to the muffled sounds of the string quartet playing just a few dozen feet above their heads. Every sound, every scrape of their crowbar, felt like a potential death sentence, a single mistake that would alert the monster in his lair. With a final, groaning protest. The iron grate gave way. Thomas, smaller and more agile, slipped through the narrow opening first, his landing muffled by a thin layer of coal dust and something softer, more unsettling. Leo followed, his body scraping against the cold, grimy metal, the smell of damp earth and stale air instantly filling his lungs. It was a descent into absolute blackness, a suffocating void where the only sound was the frantic beating of their own hearts. They stood for a moment in the oppressive dark, letting their eyes adjust, guided only by the weak beam of a small flashlight Leo held in a trembling hand. The air was frigid, but it was the odor that truly seized them. The familiar, sweetish metallic scent from the alley, now concentrated, overwhelming, and thick with the unmistakable undertones of a slaughterhouse. They were no longer just beneath the house, they were inside its stomach. The flashlight beam cut a nervous path through the darkness, revealing a scene of impossible, sterile order. The cellar was not the dusty, web-filled space they had imagined. It was a laboratory. The stone walls had been whitewashed, the floor poured with smooth, easily cleaned concrete that sloped toward a central drain. Gleaming stainless steel tables stood in neat rows, their surfaces polished to a mirror shine. On the walls, hanging from magnetic strips, was an arsenal of instruments that defied categorization. Beside heavy German cleavers and razor-sharp boning knives hung tools of a more delicate, sinister nature, surgical saws, scalpels of varying sizes, and intricate sets of forceps. It was the workspace of a creature that was equal parts butcher, surgeon, and artist, a place where the lines between preparing a meal and dissecting a body had been pathologically erased. The meticulous organization was perhaps the most terrifying detail of all. Thomas let out a choked, half-swallowed gasp, pointing the trembling flashlight beam toward a massive walk-in pantry at the far end of the cellar. The door, thick and insulated like that of a meat locker, was slightly ajar. Leo pushed it open, the cold air that billowed out a palpable, physical force. Inside, the horror was given a name and a number. Dozens of large, commercial-grade glass jars lined the shelves, each containing preserved organs and tissue samples, suspended in a clear, viscous fluid. Every jar bore a small, neatly typed label with a date, a weight, and a cryptic descriptor: L.E.S. spleen, Nov, 1928, Bowery, liver, Sept, 1928. On large, stainless steel hooks hung sections of what could only be human flesh, cured and wrapped in cheesecloth like artisanal hams, each tagged with the same cold, transactional precision. It was a larder of humanity, a library of stolen lives catalogued for future consumption. As Leo stood frozen in the doorway of the pantry, the first sounds of the raid echoed from above. The faint music and laughter were abruptly cut off, replaced by the splintering crash of the front door being battered down, followed by a cacophony of shouting and the heavy, pounding footsteps of uniformed men. The editor had kept his word. The New York City Police Department, forced into action by the threat of a front-page story, was descending upon the townhouse. The chaos upstairs was a storm breaking over the horrifying stillness of the cellar. For the first time in hours, Leo felt a surge of something other than terror, a grim, savage hope. The truth, in all its unspeakable detail, was about to be dragged from the shadows and into the light, and the city would be forced to look at what it had been consuming. The first two officers to descend the cellar stairs were hardened veterans of the force, men who thought they had witnessed every form of depravity the city had to offer. They stopped dead on the last step, their revolvers held aloft, their faces draining of all color in the harsh glare of their lanterns. The sheer, methodical evil of the scene before them was beyond any human crime they had ever encountered. It was not a place of passionate violence, but of cold, industrial processing. The air, thick with the cloying scent of blood and chemical preservatives, hit them like a physical blow. One of the officers retched violently into a corner, his body convulsing, while the other simply stood, his mouth agape, his mind struggling to process the meticulously arranged abomination that Julian Blackwood had hidden beneath his temple of gastronomy. They found Julian Blackwood not in his cellar, but in his kitchen, the gleaming, sterile heart of his public-facing operation. He was standing at his main preparation table, calmly plating the next course for his esteemed guests. His movements as fluid and precise as ever. His pristine white chef's coat was immaculate, save for a small, dark red stain on his cuff. He did not look up immediately as the police stormed in, weapons drawn. Instead, he carefully placed a single sprig of parsley onto a slice of his signature terrine before turning to face them. There was no fear in his eyes, no surprise. There was only the mild annoyance of an artist whose performance had been rudely interrupted. He placed his hands on the table, the gesture not one of surrender, but of a host waiting patiently for his uninvited guests to explain themselves. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice the same smooth, cultured baritone that had charmed a city, "you are interrupting the main course." He then looked past the stunned officers toward the ballroom doorway, where the horrified faces of his diners were beginning to appear. He offered them a serene, almost beatific smile. "My apologies for the disturbance. It seems my work is to be appraised by a less refined palate tonight." He picked up a clean napkin and delicately wiped his fingers, his gaze sweeping over the assembled titans of industry and politics. "Please, do not let this spoil your appetite. You are, after all, my most devoted critics, and tonight's dish is the culmination of my life's work, a true taste of the city." The words hung in the air, each one a drop of poison, as the horrifying implication began to dawn on his audience. As the precinct captain read him his rights, Blackwood began his confession, not as a broken criminal, but as a philosopher delivering a lecture. He explained his theory with a chilling, academic detachment. The city's poor, its forgotten, its invisible masses, were not people. They were, in his words, a raw, untapped resource, the gristle and sinew of the metropolis. He saw himself not as a murderer, but as an alchemist, a transcendent artist performing a necessary act of purification. He was, he claimed, cleansing the city of its undesirable elements, transforming its ugliness into something sublime, something worthy of being served on fine china to the very people who perpetuated the social rot he claimed to despise. It was an act of profound class contempt, a monstrous joke played on both the eater and the eaten. The guests stood frozen, porcelain plates clutched in their hands, the rich, savory terrine suddenly feeling like a leaden weight in their stomachs. A wave of nausea and comprehension washed over the room. The unique, celebrated aroma of Blackwood's secret spice blend, the scent that had defined 100 exquisite evenings, was now revealed for what it was, the cloying perfume masking the scent of cooked human flesh. The man they had hailed as a genius, an artist who had elevated dining to a near-religious experience, was a monster of insondable evil. He had not just murdered the city's forgotten, he had turned the city's elite into unwitting cannibals, making them accomplices in his final, most profound act of contempt for all of humanity. In the cellar, investigators began the grim task of cataloging the evidence. They found Eleanor Finch's worn seamstress thimble in a small wooden box containing other personal effects, buttons, cheap rings, a single child's shoe, trophies taken from his victims. Each object was a testament to a life he had consumed and erased. The scale of his operation was staggering, with evidence suggesting dozens of victims over several years, all sourced from the city's most vulnerable populations. The legend of the Macabre chef was born in that moment, not from rumor or whispered fear, but from the cold, hard evidence laid bare on the steel tables of a monster's pantry, a truth far more grotesque than any ghost story could ever be. The arrest of Julian Blackwood was not the end of a crime, but the beginning of a revelation that would scar the soul of New York. As he was led from the townhouse in handcuffs, he passed his horrified patrons, their faces a mask of revulsion and self-disgust. He looked directly at the mayor, a man who had just minutes before called him a civic treasure, and offered a final, chilling critique. "You see, Your Honor," he said, his voice calm and steady, "I have always believed in using the whole animal. It is the most ethical way." The words were his final, unrepentant testament, the perverse philosophy of a man who saw the entire city as his personal slaughterhouse and its inhabitants as nothing more than meat on the bone. The raid on Park Avenue revealed a truth that was both simple and profoundly disturbing. The greatest horrors are not supernatural, but are born from the cold, calculated choices of men, Julian Blackwood's evil was not the product of madness, but of a terrifyingly lucid ideology, a belief system that allowed him to transform human beings into ingredients. He had exploited the city's deepest social divides, using the invisibility of the poor as a shield for his atrocities. The evidence recovered from his cellar, the tools, the ledger, the human remains, would form the basis of a trial that would captivate and revolt the nation, forcing a city built on ambition and excess to confront the monster it had so willingly invited to its table. The mayor's gala of 1928 would be remembered not for its opulence, but as the last supper of an age of innocence. The confirmation of the horror was absolute, a gruesome, undeniable truth discovered in a cellar that served as both a tomb and a pantry. The story of Leo Vance's investigation, once dismissed as the fantasy of an overzealous reporter, was now a terrifying reality. The city's elite, who had feasted on his creations, were now forced to grapple with a sickening legacy, forever bound to the crimes of a man who had turned their highest form of cultural expression into the ultimate act of primal taboo. The banquet was over, and the city was about to face a long and agonizing reckoning with the darkness that had been thriving in its very heart. The trial of Julian Blackwood was less a legal proceeding and more a public autopsy of a city's soul. The prosecution, led by District Attorney Alistair Finch, no relation to the victim, a cruel irony that was not lost on the press, presented the case with a grim, methodical precision. The photographs from the cellar were displayed on large easels, their stark, clinical horror silencing the courtroom. The ledger, with its cold, commercial entries, was read aloud, each line a death knell for a forgotten life. Through it all, Julian Blackwood sat not in the defendant's chair, but on a throne of his own making. He showed no remorse, no fear, only a profound and chilling disappointment. He listened to the testimony of forensics experts detailing the contents of his pantry, as if they were uncultured critics, misinterpreting the nuances of a complex sauce. His silence was his final, most damning statement. He did not believe he had done anything wrong. The guilty verdict was a formality, but the shockwave it sent through New York society was a cataclysm. The city's elite, who had once clamored for a seat at his table, were now bound by an unbreakable cord of shame and revulsion. The scandal was not merely about a series of gruesome murders, it was about their unwitting participation. They were the final consumers in a supply chain of horror that began in the gutters of the Lower East Side and ended on their silver forks. Society pages that had once lauded Blackwood's genius now ran frantic, veiled apologies. The ignominy was absolute. For years afterward, at the most exclusive dinner parties, a moment of shared, silent dread would descend whenever a rich terrine or a dark, glistening sauce was served, the ghost of Blackwood's art haunting their palates forever. For the men and women who had dined at the townhouse, the legacy was a private and inescapable torment. Many of the city's most powerful families simply vanished from the social scene, retreating behind the high walls of their estates, unable to face the public's morbid curiosity. The mayor's gala of 1928 became a forbidden topic, a year zero in the city's social calendar. The memory of the taste, once celebrated as the pinnacle of culinary achievement, became a source of psychological poison. More than one of Blackwood's former patrons was rumored to have been committed to private asylums, driven mad by the phantom sensation of that unique, unforgettable flavor, a constant reminder of the truth they had so eagerly swallowed. They had not just been deceived, they had been branded, marked for life as participants in the city's most monstrous feast. Julian Blackwood was sentenced to life without the possibility of parole at Sing Sing Correctional Facility. He accepted his fate with the same detached serenity with which he had accepted praise. In prison, he became a creature of legend, a specter of quiet contempt who refused to participate in the mundane rituals of incarceration. He never spoke of his crimes again, but his philosophy was evident in his final, ironic protest. He refused to eat the prison's food, which he deemed unfit for consumption, and slowly, deliberately, starved himself to death in his cell over a period of several months. His death, recorded in a brief, two-line entry in the prison warden's log, was his ultimate act of control, the final dish he chose to serve, prepared only for himself. The artist had made his final critique and, in doing so, exited the stage. The Park Avenue townhouse, once the epicenter of New York's cultural life, became its most prominent wound. Seized by the state, it stood empty for years, a silent, decaying monument to the horrors discovered within its walls. No buyer could be found. Its value had been erased, replaced by a reputation so foul that the property was deemed unsalvageable. The fine wallpapers peeled in the damp, the priceless chandeliers rusted, and the grand ballroom floor became warped and stained by rain leaking through the collapsing roof. The city tried to erase it, but the structure refused to be forgotten. It became a point of morbid pilgrimage, a place where the curious would dare each other to approach the cellar grates, hoping to catch a whiff of the sweetish odor that was said to cling to the foundation like a permanent stain. Over the decades, the historical facts of the Blackwood case began to ossify into one of New York's most enduring and terrifying urban legends. The story of the Macabre chef was passed down from one generation to the next, a cautionary tale whispered to children who strayed too far from home. The details became exaggerated, embellished with supernatural elements, but the core of the horror remained unchanged. The tale warned that the most civilized surfaces could hide the most primal barbarism, and that the city's glittering facade was built upon a foundation of bones. Julian Blackwood, the man, was dead, but Blackwood, the specter, had become immortal, a permanent fixture in the city's shadow folklore, a boogeyman dressed in a pristine chef's coat. The abandoned townhouse became the focal point of these legends. Locals swore that the property was not merely empty, but actively haunted. They spoke of lights appearing in the windows of the ruined kitchen on the anniversary of the mayor's gala, of a single, lonely glow in the dead of night. The most persistent and chilling tale, however, was that of the sound. On still cold autumn nights, those who lived nearby claimed they could hear a faint, rhythmic, percussive noise emanating from the direction of the house. The steady, methodical thump, thump, thump of a heavy cleaver striking a thick wooden block. It was the sound of a meticulous artist who, even in death, refused to stop his unholy work, forever preparing a banquet for a guest list of ghosts. The case had one final bitter legacy. For a brief time, it shone a harsh, uncomfortable light on the city's forgotten population. The names of Marco Rossi, Eleanor Finch, and 24 other victims were printed in the newspapers, their faces staring out from faded photographs. They were mourned publicly, their tragedies acknowledged by the very society that had ensured their invisibility in life. But the attention was fleeting. Soon, they were remembered not for who they were but for what they had become: ingredients. Their identities were permanently subsumed by the monstrous narrative of their killer. They were the special supply from the Bowery, the cut from the Fulton market. In death, as in life, they remained a resource, their stories consumed by a public hungry for a horrifying tale. The legend of Julian Blackwood endures because it forces us to confront a deeply unsettling question. Where is the line between a valued life and a disposable one? Blackwood's monstrosity was not born in a vacuum. It was nurtured in the profound indifference of a city that divided its people into diners and ingredients. He was a predator who simply took that social contract to its most literal and grotesque conclusion. His story is a chilling reminder that the greatest evils are often not a deviation from a society's values, but a twisted reflection of them. It asks us to consider who we deem invisible and what horrors we might be willing to swallow, so long as they are served on a silver platter. The archives of history are filled with monsters like Julian Blackwood, their stories locked away in dusty files and whispered legends. These are the narratives that reveal the true fractures in our civilized world, the darkness that festers just beneath the surface of polite society. Our mission here is to unearth these records, to give voice to the shadows so that the lessons they hold are never lost to time, to ensure that these dark chapters are never sealed away and forgotten, and to continue this exploration into the most unsettling corners of our shared past. Subscribe to our channel and help us preserve the Shadow Archive.